It was not thunder that shook Germany in the summer of 1944, it was the sound of a nation cracking from within. The Reich that had once stretched across Europe was now shrinking by the week. On every front the German army was retreating. Soviet tanks rolled through the east, the Allies pushed inland from the beaches of Normandy, and Berlin's night skies burned red as British bombers passed overhead. Yet inside his fortified headquarters in East Prussia the wolf's lair Adolf Hitler still spoke of final victory, drawing red arrows across maps that no longer matched reality. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg buttoned the collar of his grey uniform and studied his reflection. The man in the mirror looked every bit the loyal officer, the Iron Cross on his chest, the black patch over the eye he had lost in North Africa, the empty sleeve pinned neatly at his side. But the face was tired, older than its 36 years. Behind the hard eyes a single thought pulsed: if Germany was to be saved, its leader had to die. Outside his window Berlin waited in silence between air raid sirens. People queued for bread that never came, children played in the rubble of houses that had once been home, and Hitler's posters, sun-faded and torn, flapped weakly in the wind. The war had eaten everything: food, fuel, faith. Within the army a quiet rebellion grew. Officers who had sworn an oath to the Führer now met in whispered circles, wondering how to break it. One of them, Colonel Henning von Treschow, summoned Stauffenberg to a private meeting. Cigarette smoke coiled through the room as Treschow spoke in a low, steady voice: "If we do nothing, Germany will have no soul left to save." Around the table sat former chiefs and staff officers Ludwig Beck, Friedrich Olbricht, Friedrich Oster, men who had once carried Hitler's dreams and now carried only guilt. Stauffenberg listened in silence, then said quietly, "Then let us begin." The plan they chose already existed inside Hitler's system. Operation Valkyrie was meant to protect the government if chaos broke out in Berlin. The reserve army would seize key buildings and restore order. The conspirators would twist that order. Once Hitler was dead, they would announce that SS units had staged a coup, then use Valkyrie to arrest the Nazi leadership and take control themselves. From that moment a new government could sue for peace with the Allies. It was treason in every sense of the word, and yet to them it felt like loyalty to Germany, not to Hitler. Each man in that room understood the cost. If they failed, their families would hang beside them. But Stauffenberg's decision was firm. He had seen too much: the bodies of his soldiers rotting in the desert, the madness in the Führer's eyes when defeat was mentioned, the senseless slaughter ordered in the name of honor. For Germany, he said simply, we must act. Weeks turned into months as they refined the plan. Messages were passed in coded notes, meetings held behind locked doors. The Gestapo's shadow lay over every conversation. One careless word could mean torture and a rope. Stauffenberg wrote to his wife Nina but never sent the letters. "If I do not return," one began, "tell our children their father died for a Germany where truth and humanity still live." He folded the page and kept it close to his heart. Twice they prepared to strike, twice fate intervened. Hitler changed his schedule, or the meeting room moved, or some small signal warned them away. Doubt crept in. Was this destiny refusing them, or fear disguising itself as prudence? Treschow insisted they could not wait. "Each day that man lives," he said, "thousands more die." At last the group agreed, the next opportunity would be the last. Stauffenberg, recently promoted, now had direct access to Hitler's military briefings. Because of his wounds, security guards allowed him to carry a briefcase nobody imagined it might contain death. Olbricht handed him the final version of the orders. "Once the bomb goes off," he said, "we activate Valkyrie immediately. Berlin, Munich, Vienna all under our command before the SS can react. Stauffenberg nodded. Then everything depends on me. Berlin's nights had become a rhythm of sirens and silence. On July 19, 1944 he stood by the window of his apartment, uniform laid out, the small explosive device hidden inside a leather case. His aide, Lieutenant Werner von Heften, asked softly, "And if it fails, sir?" Stauffenberg looked at the stars flickering between clouds. "Then we shall have shown that Germany still has men of conscience. That will be enough." The following morning dawned hot and bright. Engines growled on the airfield as Stauffenberg climbed into a waiting aircraft. Below him the landscape of his country unrolled like a scar-burnt villages, craters, forests blackened by fire. He tightened his grip on the briefcase. In a few hours he would stand before Adolf Hitler himself, in a wooden conference hut deep in the forests of East Prussia. He thought of his children, of the Germany he wished them to see, one without fear, without hatred, without endless war. For that vision he was ready to lose everything. The propellers roared, the plane lifted through a veil of cloud, and the world beneath grew small. "If I fail today," he whispered to himself, "then Germany will fail with me." The aircraft banked east toward the Wolf's Lair, slicing through the sunlight like a blade. Behind him, in Berlin, the conspirators waited for the signal that would change history or end their lives. Seeds of Rebellion, written as one smooth English narrative, no headings, no repetition, around 1,050 words, continuing directly from where Chapter 1 ended. Dash. The flight to East Prussia felt longer than it should have. The air was clear, but Stauffenberg's mind was thick with calculation. Every movement, every minute ahead of him had to unfold with precision. The slightest hesitation could undo years of planning. Below, Germany stretched out like a battlefield of ghosts. Villages without men, fields without harvest. The fatherland he loved was bleeding out, and the men responsible waited at the end of this journey. Inside the Wolf's Lair, guards paced with mechanical discipline. The smell of pine mixed with diesel and sweat. It was no palace, just concrete, wire, and fear. Hitler ruled his empire from these bunkers, where sunlight was rare and suspicion constant. By the time Stauffenberg arrived, his uniform spotless and his briefcase clutched tight in his remaining hand, the morning meeting had already begun to assemble. A guard checked his papers, saluted, and waved him through. He was inside the cage of the lion. Hitler greeted him with the same strange warmth he reserved for officers who had bled for Germany. "Ah, Stauffenberg," he said, his voice thin, almost polite. "You look well." The irony was cruel. Stauffenberg bowed, murmured a thanks, and placed his briefcase on the table beside the heavy oak leg. Around them, maps littered the surface, front lines drawn in red and blue, frontiers that no longer existed. Officers argued over imaginary victories. Outside, engines hummed, phones rang, orders were shouted. Inside, a bomb waited. But this was not yet the moment. The chapter of his mission that began at the Wolf's Lair would unfold later. For now, in the days and hours leading up to that instant, the roots of rebellion spread across Germany, unseen but alive. Back in Berlin, Ulbricht rehearsed the activation of Valkyrie again and again. The plan had to be flawless. One wrong command, one delay in communication, and the SS would crush them before they could move. Secretaries copied orders on thin paper, stamping them with official seals stolen from the high command. Even typists risked death. In hidden rooms across the city, typewriters clattered like gunfire, forging the paperwork of a new regime that did not yet exist. Meanwhile, General Ludwig Beck, once chief of the General Staff, sat in silence, rereading a letter he had written months earlier but never sent. It was his resignation, addressed to Hitler himself, a quiet confession that the Führer had doomed the nation. Now Beck waited, a revolver at his side, prepared to lead the provisional government if the plot succeeded or to use the weapon on himself if it failed. Everyone involved had already accepted death as part of the plan. In Paris, the German military commander Karl Heinrich von Stulpnagel was prepared to arrest the SS as soon as the signal reached him. In Vienna, other officers waited for coded words that would set their troops in motion. The rebellion was a spider's web stretching across the Reich, its strands invisible, its strength untested. Each man knew only his part, each name a secret kept even from allies. They had to move like ghosts, because one whisper in the wrong ear could bring Gestapo boots to their door before morning. Even within the conspiracy there were doubts. Some believed that killing Hitler would change nothing, that another fanatic would replace him, that Germany was too far gone to save. Others argued they had no moral right to decide who should live or die. Stauffenberg listened but said little. His faith was not in politics anymore but in conscience. "We are not born to succeed," he told Ulbricht once, "but to act rightly before God." His words carried a quiet conviction that silenced the room. Every day he moved between two worlds, the obedient officer by daylight, the traitor by night. He attended briefings, saluted generals, carried Hitler's orders across the front, all while carrying the thought of his death in his pocket. Even his driver noticed the change. "You seem distant, sir," the man said once. "Just tired," Stauffenberg replied, though he hardly slept. On July 15, a chance came. Hitler scheduled a conference at the Wolf's Lair, and Stauffenberg was invited. He armed the bomb, but the meeting was suddenly moved from a closed bunker to an open-air hut. The change of location could weaken the blast. Worse, Himmler, the other man they needed dead, was not present. At the last moment, he withdrew. He returned to Berlin furious but composed. "We cannot depend on chance," he told Treschow over the phone. "We must make our own." Treschow, ever the realist, responded quietly, "Even if he survives, we must show the world that Germans tried to stop him. History must not think we agreed with this madness." His voice carried the exhaustion of a man who had fought too long for a lost cause. A few days later, Treschow went to the front and took his own life, leaving behind a note, "Others will continue the fight. May God forgive us all." That message reached Stauffenberg like a final push. He realized the time for hesitation had passed. In Berlin, the conspirators agreed the next meeting with Hitler would be the day. The explosives were prepared once more, the detonators checked, the briefcase adjusted to hide the device perfectly beneath its leather lining. Werner von Haeften stayed by his side, loyal beyond question. They spoke little now, there was nothing left to say. Outside, the capital trembled under the roar of distant bombs. The city smelled of smoke and fear. Posters still promised victory, but people no longer looked up to read them. In taverns and train stations, men whispered about the Russians, about the end that was coming. Yet somewhere within those crumbling walls, a handful of officers still dared to believe that one act could change the course of history. On the night of July 19, Stauffenberg stood in his study, papers spread across the desk. The candlelight trembled as a draft passed through the open window. He checked the bomb again, timed the detonator, and closed the case. His wife's photograph lay beside it. He looked at it for a long time, tracing her smile with his remaining hand, then slipped the picture into his coat. Outside, church bells rang faintly through the dark. It sounded like both an ending and a beginning. When dawn arrived, the city was wrapped in a gray stillness. His car waited at the gate, the driver already awake. Stauffenberg stepped inside without a word, the briefcase resting across his knees. As the engine rumbled to life, he turned once toward the spires of Berlin disappearing in the mist. Everything he loved lay behind him, everything he feared waited ahead. The morning sun cut through a haze of pine and smoke as the plane descended toward East Prussia. The airfield near the Wolf's Lair was quiet, too quiet for the center of a collapsing empire. Stauffenberg stepped down from the aircraft, his cap pulled low against the glare. Soldiers saluted as he passed, few noticed the briefcase clutched in his hand or the strain in his face. To them he was a hero returned from the front, a man the Führer himself admired. The irony was almost unbearable. A car waited to take him through the forest. The road wound between tall, dark trees that hid miles of barbed wire, sentry towers, and concrete bunkers. Signs warned of landmines on both sides. The driver spoke only once. "You've come for the briefing, sir?" "Yes," Stauffenberg answered, his voice steady though his pulse wasn't. "A very important briefing." Inside the complex, everything smelled of oil and damp earth. Guards with rifles stood at every door, dogs barking somewhere beyond the fences. The Wolf's Lair was less a headquarters than a fortress Hitler's paranoia made solid. Each visitor was checked, each paper stamped twice. But Stauffenberg's status gave him passage. His wounds made the guards sympathetic, even careless. They searched the left side of his coat but not the right, where his missing hand made carrying anything impossible. They didn't notice that the briefcase seemed unusually heavy. He was escorted to a small hut beside the main conference hall, a wooden room where he could prepare his notes. Werner von Heften joined him, locking the door behind them. Both men knew what had to be done. The bomb lay disassembled in the case, its parts wrapped in brown paper. With only one hand, Stauffenberg worked slowly, clumsily, setting the pencil detonator and pressing the cap to break the vial inside. The chemical hissed faintly, starting the 10-minute fuse. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He slipped the active charge into the briefcase, then turned to Heften. "Now we are committed," he said. An officer appeared at the door, impatient. "Colonel, the Führer is waiting." Stauffenberg nodded, lifted the briefcase with his remaining hand, and followed. The hut that served as Hitler's conference room was stifling, packed with men and heavy with the smell of sweat and tobacco. Maps covered the walls, lines and arrows marking battles already lost. Hitler stood at the far end, bent over a table, pale and trembling but still commanding every inch of attention. His voice rasped as he discussed troop movements no one believed in anymore. Stauffenberg edged closer to the table, hard hammering. He placed the briefcase on the floor beside the thick oak leg nearest Hitler. The position was crucial, the leg would either deflect the blast or direct it. For a moment he hesitated, then gently nudged the case with his foot to angle it toward Hitler's side. His mouth was dry. If this fails, he thought, let it at least fail cleanly. An aide handed him documents to review. Using the excuse of a phone call, he asked to step outside. The guard at the door barely looked up as he exited. Heften was waiting outside, feigning boredom. Together they walked calmly through the corridor, then faster, almost running as they reached the car. No one stopped them. Behind them, in that stifling hut, the clock ticked toward noon. At 12:42 p.m., the explosion tore through the conference room. A flash of white light, a roar that shattered windows across the compound, splinters slicing through air. The force hurled men off their feet, flames licking at the walls. For several seconds there was only ringing silence. Then shouts, confusion, smoke. The guards rushed in, dragging out bodies, some dead, some half alive. 4 officers were killed instantly. Others lay bleeding on the grass. But Hitler lived. By chance, the thick table leg had shielded him from the full force of the blast. His trousers were shredded, his eardrums burst, but he was alive, dazed, furious, and more convinced than ever that fate protected him. It was an assassination, he screamed. They will all pay. Unaware of this miracle, Stauffenberg's car sped away from the wolf's lair. He looked back once and saw black smoke rising over the trees. It is done, he whispered. He believed Hitler was dead. Relief and exhaustion washed through him. Now Germany can be free. They reached the airfield and took off for Berlin. In the plane's narrow cabin, Stauffenberg dictated urgent messages: Hitler is dead. Operation Valkyrie is to be executed immediately. All SS units are to be disarmed. Heften worked the radio, sending coded orders to Olbricht and Beck. The machine clicked and hummed as words that could change history flew through the air toward Berlin. In the capital, the conspirators sprang into action. Telephones rang, messengers ran through corridors, orders were signed and stamped. Reserve army units began to mobilize. Officers loyal to the plot arrested SS commanders in several buildings. Beck prepared a proclamation announcing the new government. Everything seemed to be working. For the first time, hope stirred in their chests. They believed they had done the impossible. But soon the first cracks appeared. Communications from the wolf's lair were chaotic, the lines went dead, then came alive again. By early evening, radio broadcasts confirmed the unthinkable: Hitler was alive. His voice, shaky but distinct, came across the airwaves. A bomb has exploded at my headquarters, he declared. But I am unhurt. This is the treachery of our own officers. They will be punished. In that moment, everything collapsed. Officers who had hesitated now switched sides again. Soldiers stopped following orders. The SS, furious and armed, began rounding up anyone connected to the coup. The reserve army commander, General Fromm, turned on his own men to save himself. Olbricht and Stauffenberg were arrested in their offices at Bendler Block. Beck, realizing it was over, quietly asked for a pistol and shot himself before they could drag him away. As night fell, Stauffenberg and Heften stood before a firing squad in the courtyard, floodlights glaring against the dark. He refused a blindfold. His last words were calm: "Long live our sacred Germany." The shots rang out, echoing off the stone walls, and then there was silence. By dawn, the rebellion was over. The Nazi regime struck back with merciless speed. Thousands were arrested, hundreds executed, their families ruined. Yet within that night of failure, something had changed. Even Hitler could not erase the fact that men within his own army had tried to stop him not for power, but for conscience. In the smoldering ruins of a nation that would soon collapse entirely, the story of the man with the bomb spread quietly among soldiers and civilians alike. Some called him a traitor, others a hero. But in the years that followed, when the Third Reich finally crumbled and the world tried to understand how evil could grow unchecked, many remembered Claus von Stauffenberg not as the man who failed to kill Hitler, but as the man who dared to try. The streets of Berlin were silent at first, almost deceptively calm. Smoke still lingered in the alleys from the bombings and skirmishes, but the city seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which way the tide would turn. Inside the Bendler Block, the nerve center of Operation Valkyrie, chaos had already taken hold. Officers ran between rooms, shouting orders into empty corridors, while others froze, staring at radios that now carried Hitler's triumphant voice. The Führer was alive, and the illusion of control that the conspirators had built vanished like smoke in the wind. General Friedrich Olbricht paced the office, hands pressed to his face, while Major Otto Riemer, loyal to the Reich, moved through the halls with a calculated calm, rounding up anyone linked to the failed plot. Messages that had been dispatched across Berlin were now intercepted or ignored. Soldiers who had followed orders hours before suddenly questioned their loyalty. Some joined the SS, others deserted, leaving entire units in disarray. The city became a stage for confusion, fear, and sudden violence, a microcosm of the crumbling empire outside. In homes across Germany, families listened to Hitler's radio broadcast, his voice distorted by anger and wounded pride. Traitors have struck at the heart of the Reich, he declared, but they will not prevail. The German people will see justice. Mothers clutched children close, while men in uniform debated what to do next. Many could not reconcile their oath to the Führer with the horror of what the officers had attempted. It was a moral quagmire, and the consequences would be swift and merciless. Back at the Bendler block, Stauffenberg's absence was felt like a vacuum. His plan had been precise, elegant in its audacity, yet it relied on communication, on every cog in the machine turning at the right moment. Now, with Hitler alive, the cogs jammed. Commands were ignored or reversed. Brigades that should have secured government buildings faltered. SS officers, once isolated by the conspirators' strategy, regained their authority and moved decisively to crush any opposition. What had been a coordinated seizure of power became a desperate scramble to survive. Meanwhile, Berlin's reserve army tried to rally. Some officers, emboldened by Valkyrie's framework, attempted to maintain momentum, but the confidence that had propelled them for hours now eroded. Rumors spread like wildfire: Hitler was alive, Himmler and Goebbels were mobilizing loyalists, and the Gestapo had already identified key conspirators. Fear infected the streets as the SS executed arrests with ruthless efficiency. Families were torn apart, men were dragged from homes, their screams echoing in the narrow alleyways. The conspirators' network, once invisible and precise, unraveled in hours. In quieter corners of the city, Beck's final act of defiance became a haunting symbol. His suicide was discovered early that afternoon, a note left behind explaining his despair and his hope that others might continue the fight. Yet for many, it was too little, too late. The news reached Olbricht and Stauffenberg as they were led through the courtyard of the Bendler block, flanked by SS officers. Each step echoed on the stone floor, carrying the weight of failure, inevitability, and the knowledge that the Reich would exact vengeance without hesitation. Stauffenberg's composure never faltered, though inside he wrestled with a storm of thought. The streets beyond the walls were no longer the same streets he had walked as an obedient officer. They were now terrain for terror, marked by betrayal, courage, and the raw edge of human desperation. Hefton, beside him, offered a steady gaze but no words. They both understood that their choices, their courage, had led them here, and there was no escape from what awaited. At the Wolf's Lair, Hitler and his inner circle consolidated power with alarming speed. Himmler, Goebbels, and Keitel moved decisively to eliminate anyone who had shown even the faintest suspicion of disloyalty. Lists of names were compiled and cross-referenced, arrests executed within hours. The Führer, invigorated by survival, delivered speeches emphasizing loyalty, faith, and the sacred duty of obedience. Fear and propaganda intertwined, cementing his control as the nation held its breath in the aftermath of near annihilation. Outside Berlin, the reverberations of the failed Valkyrie operation spread to military units across Europe. In France, the officers who had awaited Stauffenberg's coded orders now faced the realization that the plot had collapsed. In Vienna, resistance pockets were swiftly crushed. Soldiers who had entertained the notion of siding with the conspirators found themselves under scrutiny, their movements monitored, and their families threatened. The machinery of the Third Reich, brutal and efficient, reasserted itself in a way that left little room for dissent. As night fell over the city, executions began. Stauffenberg and Heften, led to the courtyard under floodlights, faced the firing squad with the discipline of soldiers who had made their peace with death. Their final words, calm and dignified, reflected a defiance that no bullet could erase. "Long live our sacred Germany," Stauffenberg whispered, and the shots rang out, echoing against the stone walls of the Bendler block, a final punctuation to hours of hope and despair intertwined. In the weeks that followed, the regime's retaliation became a dark obsession. Hundreds of officers implicated, directly or indirectly, were executed or imprisoned. Families of the conspirators were punished, stripped of property, sent to concentration camps. The Reich demonstrated its capacity for vengeance with ruthless precision, ensuring that the consequences of defiance were etched into the consciousness of every soldier, officer, and citizen. Fear became a tool as effective as any weapon on the battlefield. Yet even in the shadow of failure, whispers persisted. Among soldiers, civilians, and surviving officers, tales of Stauffenberg's courage circulated quietly. They spoke not of the plot's failure but of the courage required to stand against tyranny. In the chaos of a collapsing empire, such stories became small sparks of conscience, reminders that even the most formidable power could be questioned, even momentarily, by human will. By the end of July, the Valkyrie plot had been erased from the Reich's official records, labeled as treachery and cowardice. Hitler's survival became a propaganda tool, a way to showcase the invincibility of his leadership. Yet in the hearts of those who had acted, a different truth endured. The attempt had proven that opposition existed, that within the ranks of the army, men could think, judge, and act on principle. Even in defeat, that realization carried weight, sowing the seeds of moral resistance that would echo long after the war's end. Berlin, scarred and tense, resumed its daily rhythm under authoritarian rule, but the cracks had deepened. Hitler's paranoia grew, trust became nearly impossible, and every officer looked over his shoulder. The Valkyrie conspiracy, though crushed, left a mark. It exposed fear, loyalty, courage, and betrayal in equal measure. It was a reminder that power was fragile, that obedience could be challenged, and that even in the darkest chapters of history, individual conscience could shine briefly, fiercely, before being extinguished.